people that we should thank and recognize, I want to, of course, introduce you to, if you're not already familiar with, as he has been a speaker with us for a number of years now, Lieutenant Colonel Jay Stout. And I want to thank him especially, coming all the way from the East Coast to be with us here. Thank you so much, Jay. Lieutenant Colonel retired Jay Stout is a retired United States Marine Corps fighter pilot. He was commissioned in 1981. He became a naval aviator in 1983. His first fleet assignment was in F-4S Phantoms. He transitioned to the F-18 Hornet and flew on bases all over from coast to coast. During his 20-year career, he flew more than 4,500 flight hours, including 37 combat missions in Operation Desert Storm. How about a hand for that, folks? Thank you for your service, Jay. He is published in articles, even during active duty articles on the Osprey, the Hornet, and the effectiveness of the AV-8 Harrier, including now, in his retired years, he's the author of a number of books, including the one on the topic here today, Fortress Ploesti. And I won't stand in the way of that any further because I know we want to hear more about it. But folks, don't leave today before you get your signed copy. This is a rare opportunity, as I said. We had to bring him back from the East Coast. Of course, I don't know if the weather was any kind of a temptation or not, but I'm going to say it was all just to see me. How about a hand for him, folks? Lieutenant Colonel Jay Stout.
Thank you for that, Greg. Can everyone hear me okay? It's always a pleasure to be here. I love this museum. It's a fantastic facility, great staff, great exhibits, and of course, kind and gracious patrons. Thanks for sharing your time with me. Today, we're going to be talking about two separate topics. One is one of the most spectacularly savage, low-level bombing attacks in history. Nothing like this had ever been seen before. And happily, nothing like this has ever happened again. Second topic I'm going to cover briefly is the subsequent aerial campaign that actually achieved the objective that was assigned to that first raid. This is a topic that has a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different facets, a lot of detail. We could probably spend a 2 or 3 day symposium talking about all of it, but as I see that very few of you have brought your pajamas and toothbrushes, we'll keep it to just under an hour. I'd like, if you would, for you to consider that name right there. Now, I grew up in the time of phonics, and I'm guessing by looking out there that most of you were just like me. And we've Americanized or anglicized this word. Most of us grew up pronouncing it Ploesti. Well, through the duration of this presentation, I'm going to use the Romanian pronunciation, and I may butcher it here a little bit, but the pronunciation is Ploiești. Now, if you take nothing away at all from today's presentation, you got that little bit, that little nugget of information. So it is Fortress Ploiești. As I always do, I love to remind the audience that I was once a fighter pilot, and there is nothing so near and dear to a fighter pilot's heart as himself. And I love to talk about myself, but Greg did that already, so we won't dwell on that. Okay, Ploiești, what was the big deal about that? Well, think about it as a little bit of Texas in southeastern Europe. If we consider the Soviet Union part of Europe, aside from the Soviet Union, no other region produced as much oil as Ploiești, and that made it very, very valuable. So where was it? Well, it still is. It's in Romania. It had a history of very dark and murky politics. Leading up to the war, early part of the war, it was a kingdom. There was a coup by a fascist group. They became the new government. About the same time, chunks of Romania were ceded away or seized by Bulgaria and Hungary, and Romania turned to Germany for protection, And Germany agreed that it would, for that alignment, help protect Romania from further land grabs. And of course, among many other things, Germany got access to Romania's oil, Ploesti's oil. It is, as we'll see here, southeastern Europe, about 40 miles northwest of the capital of Bucharest. You can also see that it's pretty far from anywhere the Allies were operating early in the war. It's about 1,600 miles from England, about 1,200 miles from North Africa, not easily reached. It was believed to be fairly safe from Allied air attacks. So why was it important? Well, Germany, of course, needed fuel, needed oil, so that it could operate its armed forces. Now, Germany was not an oil producer. It produced only about 1% of the globe's total output. It did have reserves or supplies of dirty coal, lignite, and it worked with a great deal of vigor to develop processes to extract fuel from this dirty coal. And they had some success, but it wasn't nearly enough success to meet their requirements. Consequently, Ploesti was very important. In fact, Churchill recognized that when he declared that Ploesti was the taproot or the source of German might. So what could the Allies do about it? Not much, certainly not early on. I'm not going to dwell too much on this slide except to note that there was a small air detachment of B-24s that were dispatched from the United States. They were on their way to China, where they were going to operate to conduct nuisance raids against Japan and kind of try and keep Japan back on their heels. Long and short of it was, the bases they were supposed to operate from were captured by the Japanese, so they were stopped short in Egypt. And as a consolation prize, they were given the raid, or a raid, to Ploesti. And they managed, well, first I'll say it was a very bold and audacious plan. It was also very amateurish and naive. They knew very little about Ploesti. They didn't know what its defenses were. They weren't sure of the layout of the refineries, and they didn't know what the weather was going to be. But they went anyway. They sent about 12 aircraft airborne during the night of June 12, 1942. They arrived in the early morning. There was a lot of cloud cover. They dumped their bombs all over southern Romania, hit nothing of importance, and the raid is not remarkable for any reason at all, except that it was the first time the United States had bombed a target in Europe. But more negatively, it alarmed or alerted the Germans and the Romanians that, in fact, Ploesti was in range of Allied bombers, and it caused them to significantly increase their air defenses in the vicinity, much to the detriment of follow-on American attacks in the area. So not much happened for more than a year in the context of Ploesti. By the summer of 1943, the Allies were finally in a position to do something. They had won the war in North Africa, so they had North Africa to use as a base for additional operations. July of 43, they had invaded Sicily. The invasion of Italy was imminent. It would ultimately happen in September of 43, but they felt like they could do something now about Ploesti. It was really growing even more critical to the Germans because of the Soviets advancing from the east and the great around-the-clock air campaign that the Americans and the British were mounting from bases in England. So destroying Ploesti would go a long ways towards shortening the war. Now, Allied planners and analysts determined that it would take a raid of 1,000 bombers to inflict the kind of damage that needed to be done. And of course, at that point, they didn't have 1,000 bombers. So they considered another notion. Now, picture this, if you will. I'm a bomber airplane, and I am standing at the edge of the roof of a 40-story building. Now, that would never happen in real life because I'm petrified of heights. But here I am, I'm a bomber standing on the edge of a 40-story building, and my target is below me, and it's a bucket. And my bombs are a handful of coins. Now, if I was to drop these coins, very few, if any, would land in that bucket. I would need a whole lot more of me up on the edge of that building, dropping a whole lot more coins or bombs into that bucket, which is my target. But let's consider I get down from the edge of that building with a great deal of enthusiasm, and now I'm back on the ground, and that bucket is at my feet. Well, I can take that handful of coins, my bombs, and drop them into that target, that bucket, virtually 100% of the time. I'm going to be much more accurate. And that's sort of the analog the planners were using for this concept. They felt that they could take a force much less than 1,000. They figured with 150 bombers, they could send them across Ploesti at low altitude, drop these bombs, hit the most critical nodes, and do some real effective, meaningful damage. And also they considered that it might be an opportunity to surprise the defenses. Coming in low like that, they'd be unexpected. They probably wouldn't suffer many losses. So what they did is brief this plan up and down the chain of command, including the president and Winston Churchill, believe it or not. And Churchill said when he found out the code name, which was soap suds, which had been generated by some random code name gonculator, Churchill said, that's a stupid code name. Give it something more meaningful because this is really important and a lot of people are going to die. So they came up with the code name of tidal wave. And they were going to use B-24s. Now, this was the most modern bomber we had at the time, excepting the B-29, which wouldn't be used in numbers until later in the war and in the Pacific. But the B-24 had really good range, a lot of modern techniques or technologies, especially the Davis wing, which helped optimize its range. Even then, though, it was determined that extra fuel tanks would need to be added to the aircraft, and they put them inside the bomb bay. But ultimately, they set that attack date for August 1st, 1943. They figured they needed 150 plus bombers to make this happen. That equated to about 5 bomb groups. A bomb group, depending on a number of factors, ranges from 30 aircraft to maybe 45 or so. There were 2 bomb groups already in place in North Africa, operating out of the area of Benghazi in Libya. And they sent 3 more down from the 8th Air Force in England. And then they set, for a couple weeks plus, they set about training for this plan to strike Ploesti, which was very tightly scripted, very tightly choreographed, and required meticulous timing. On top of that, they had to get those crews used to flying at very low altitude. Typically, they lumbered along at high altitude, above 20,000 feet certainly, where things didn't seem to be happening very fast. Now, at 200 miles an hour, just 200 feet or below above the ground, that suddenly becomes very exciting and very dangerous. But the crews loved it. It was fun. The engineers had put together a miniature Ploesti. They built it out of a variety of material out in the desert, and the crews practiced against this miniature Ploesti. The engineers were confounded because every once in a while the Bedouins or the nomads would wander across, find all this material, and cart off what they wanted or needed, and their miniature Ploesti would be ruined and they'd have to rebuild it. Miserable conditions. It was a summer in North Africa, very hot, very fine dust that got into everything from noses, ears, mouths, teeth, everywhere else you can imagine, as well as in the aircraft. electronic components, fuel systems, hydraulic systems, oil systems. The engines they wore out a lot quicker than they would have elsewhere, for instance, in the States or back in England. So the aircraft got worn out pretty quickly. This was recognized by virtually everyone as a risky effort. In fact, there were some in Bomber Command, 9th Bomber Command, who considered the notion of circulating a petition among the different group commanders saying, this is stupid, we don't think we ought to do this, which you do not do in the military. That was a really weird thing. So that gives you an indication of the strength of the feelings against this raid. Now, it was 1,200 miles from Benghazi to Ploesti. That's right at the edge of the B-24's range. The aircraft weren't in top mechanical condition because of those desert conditions. There was no fighter escort because we didn't have fighters that could take the bombers all the way to Ploesti. And they didn't know for sure, but they suspected that the enemy defenses were very, very capable. And in fact, that did develop to be the case. This was the planned route. You can see each group had its own little airfield around Benghazi. They were going to take off across the Mediterranean, hit the island of Corfu in Greece, cross Yugoslavia, a little bit of Bulgaria, on into Romania, where they're going to drop to very low level, fly to an initial point northwest of Ploesti, drop down to, again, as low as they could stand it, hit Ploesti, and then fight their way back. So then, August 1st, 1943, these 5 bomb groups get airborne. A tremendous dust storm created by all those engines and all those aircraft getting airborne at once. One aircraft crashed in a spectacular, you can imagine this thing's full of fuel and bombs. It was a horrible spectacle, and miraculously, two people survived. They started out across the Mediterranean for reasons that nobody knows. Another aircraft simply tumbled out of the formation into the sea. They had been hoping for an element of surprise because of the low-level plan, and this was a little bit naive. Radio listening stations were already tipped off by the time of takeoff that something big was afoot. There was radar in Sicily that spotted them, as well as in Greece, Yugoslavia, and Romania. So the Germans and Romanians knew that something was going on. They just did not know specifically what the target was. And then they were spotted by Bulgarian fighters. These were Czech-built Avia B-534s. And really, instead of a modern fighter, they looked more like a vestige of World War I. They tried to get in position to attack. They simply were not fast enough to catch the bombers and get into a position from which they could make an attack. And of course, you move 170-some bombers across southern Europe, somebody's going to see you, and a whole lot of somebodies did see them. So there was plenty of notice that the Americans were coming. And then the plan started to come undone. As they started to cross into Europe, the front half of the formation, the 2 front groups, started to outspeed the back 3 groups. And you ask, well, how could that happen? Why was that so? What took place? And here's what Jay Stout believes what happened. The commander of the mission was Colonel Keith Compton. And he had decided early on, he told the different group commanders, we are going to fly this mission at maximum range airspeed. We want to squeeze every mile we can out of every gallon of gas. And one of the group commanders was Colonel John Killer Kane, and he said, that's a stupid idea. These engines are worn out as it is, and if you try and draw that much power from them, they're going to fail, and a lot of us are not going to get back. And Colonel Compton said, thank you very much for your input, but we're going to operate at the higher airspeed. So you have 5 groups in formation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As they cross into Europe, start to make their way up towards Romania, the 3rd group starts to lag, and it traps the other 2 groups, the 4th and 5th group, behind them. And that distance starts to build until it's 20, 30 minutes. It is huge. And you'll never guess who was in charge, who was leading that 3rd formation. It was Colonel Kane. Now, regardless of the reason, his job was to maintain the integrity of that formation, and he did not. So I believe the blame for that separation belongs to Colonel Kane, and sadly he's not here to defend himself, but that's what I believe. Colonel Compton was not without blame either. As the formation makes its way into Romania in 2 separate pieces, and approaches the point where it needs to turn onto its final attack heading for Ploesti, Colonel Compton turns too early. Instead of pointing at Ploesti, he's pointed at Bucharest. Some of his commanders and the elements following recognize that but follow him anyway. Some of them recognize that and then proceed on the correct course. So all those weeks of training, all that carefully scripted planning, that tightly choreographed mission came apart before they ever arrived in the vicinity of Ploesti. And here, I'm not sure exactly at what point in the mission this photograph was taken, but you can see everyone is not flying in concert, in formation here. We've got some going straight, some turning, some lagging to the outside of the turn, some turning the different direction. Obviously, there's a formation above them taking this photo. This is not what I would have expected, and I'm sure this is not what the planners had in mind. This was the plan. Everyone was supposed to go to the initial point of Ploesti, attack their targets all at the same time in Ploesti, clear the targets, take a heart right turn, and get the heck out of Dodge as quickly as they could. This is what actually happened. The leader, Colonel Compton, didn't realize his mistake until almost at Bucharest. He turned around, turned north. Other elements had already started attacking. There were fighters airborne, a lot of anti-aircraft fire, refineries were on fire. He takes a look and says, we're not going in there. Goes around Ploesti, clears his commanders or the rest of his aircraft to drop on targets of opportunity. They hit nothing worthwhile, and then he circumnavigates the fight and makes his way back to Benghazi. Now, the mission was saved or salvaged because some of the elements, some of the groups were able to follow the correct course in their prescribed plan. Other elements were completely out of position, but those formation leaders, even individual aircraft, took the initiative. They realized they were there to kill refineries. There's a refinery in front of me. It's not mine, but I'm going to blow it up anyway. And so you had aircraft coming in from all different directions at very low level, down to 30 and 40 feet. Let me paint a picture for you. Again, you've got B-24s, big bomber, 30 feet to 200 feet, racing along at 200 miles an hour. There are anti-aircraft defenses ranging from large caliber cannons, medium caliber cannons, small caliber, machine guns, guys with rifles and pistols, kids with sticks and stones, old ladies shaking their fists, shouting dirty words. It was awful. You had German and Romanian fighters diving in and amongst the bombers. Bombers were literally getting knocked to the ground and exploding in big sheets of flame. Other bombers that were hit climbed up, trying to get high enough so their crews could jump from the aircraft, could parachute. You had smoke pots, which were smoke generators around the refineries, which were designed to create a lot of smoke to hide them. You had refineries already hit and on fire and generating tremendous smoke. You had a flak train. This was a train that, instead of boxcars, had carriages on which anti-aircraft guns were mounted. And in fact, this train got underway and ran parallel to and in between two bomb groups, such that you had a running gun duel because the gunners were letting loose with everything they had. Each bomber had 8 50 caliber machine guns. They could fire 10 rounds a second, as big as my thumb. You had gunners dropping dead at their position on the guns on the flak train. You had aircraft being shot down by that flak train. And finally, somebody hit the boiler on that train and it was stopped dead on its track. I would like to read an excerpt to give you a flavor of what these men went through. This is a story of the pilot of SADSAC 2, which was Henry Lasco, and his co-pilot, Joseph Kill. SADSAC 2 was inbound at only 50 feet with the rest of the formation when one of the waist gunners was hit in the thigh. He made a move to bail out, but he reconsidered when he realized that the nearby treetops were at the same level as his position. Soon after, just before bomb release, the tail gunner was shot dead. Only a moment later, inside the blackness and fire overhead the target, the bombs were dropped and the navigator was struck by a large caliber round that tore away his chest. Also by now, the number 2 engine had been shot out and feathered. Bursting clear of the conflagration, Lasco and Kill manhandled the bomber toward another formation of 6 aircraft in front of them. Once again, under intense fire, the top turret gunner and the radio operator were hit. While trying to bring their badly vibrating aircraft into the protective formation of other bombers, SADSAC 2 was attacked from the rear by a pack of Me-109s. One of the legs of the other waist gunner, who had not been wounded up to that point, was nearly torn away. SADSAC 2 was a flying wreck. Both Lasco and Kill knew that there was no way it would make the trip back to Benghazi. It was difficult to control, ammunition was cooking off, and it was holed in dozens of places. Worse, most of the crew was wounded or dead. It was then that a German fighter, an Me-109, circled around and attacked from the forward quarter. Lasco's face and jaw were shot through, and he fell over the control wheel. Kill flew the aircraft into a cornfield. The damaged bomber crumpled into pieces and caught fire. Kill, who had been relatively unharmed up to this point, sustained 2 broken legs. In shock and suffering from wounds, the crewmen who were still alive managed to pull each other from what was left of their aircraft. As they stumbled around the wreck, injured and badly burned, the crewmen were variously beaten, stoned, and robbed by Romanian peasants. Finally, the police showed up and they were taken and given medical treatment. Now, down on the ground, the people, the citizens of Romania, were variously incredulous, frightened, in wonderment of what was going on. Ion Nan was a worker at the Astra Romana refinery that day. He remembered that the big B-24s had stars with 5 corners and mistakenly wondered how the Russians could have the technology to build such aircraft. He climbed into a fellow engineer's motorcycle sidecar, and together they raced out of the complex to escape the bombing. In the Prahova River, they spotted a wounded American who was stuck in his parachute and near drowning. They pulled him out of the river and took him to a local hospital, such that he could be treated for his burns. None was touched when the American tried to thank him by giving him his fountain pen. He told the battered flyer, keep the pen. He would need it to write letters to his family. So then they tried to go home. A lot of them were flying damaged aircraft. They had wounded and dead on board. They were low on fuel, and some of them were leaking even more fuel. Not only that, they were attacked by German fighters over Bulgaria and Greece. There's one of the more famous photos from Ploesti. You can see that the aircraft that took that photo was even lower than they were. Romanian fighters on the left, German fighters on the right. There is a flak train. It's not the one from Ploesti, but it gives you an idea. And then again, probably the most iconic photograph of the raid at Ploesti. And here I'd like to make a point. You saw the photo of the woman with her young son. It was almost in the succeeding days like the carnival had come to town. Romanians swarmed out to look at these machines. They'd seen nothing like it before. It was almost like a field day. So was the attack worth it? Well, it did create real damage. 40% of the refining capacity there was destroyed, even though the raid was botched and there were 2 refineries that weren't even hit. The losses were incredible, the highest that the United States had ever experienced in a large bomber raid up to this point. Almost a third of the aircraft were lost. 40 of them were shot down. 7 of them diverted into neutral Turkey. Turkey kept the aircraft and eventually repatriated the airmen. And then there were a number of aircraft lost in accidents. 310 men killed. You think about that, put it in context, that's 31 small-town baseball teams. 109 were captured, and again, 78 interned by Turkey. Now, this raid was recognized for what it was. It was an effort that was salvaged by courage on the part of virtually every airman who participated. And every airman who participated was, in fact, awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. There were also a number of Silver Stars and Distinguished Service Crosses awarded, as well as 5 Medals of Honor. So what happened next? Ideally, the United States would have followed up with another raid, maybe a week later, and then another raid, and then another raid to keep Ploesti tamped down. We didn't have the resources for that. There were competing concerns. There was a war going on elsewhere, and those aircraft and crews were needed elsewhere. Repairing Ploesti was a real high priority for the Germans and the Romanians. They got first priority for expertise, material, labor, and equipment, and they started to work immediately. And they also took the opportunity not just to make repairs, but to make improvements, such that within a couple months, Ploesti was making more fuel than it had before the raid. And worse, they improved the defenses, more of everything: guns, aircraft radars, smoke generators, barrage balloons. Meanwhile, the Allies are gaining the advantage in the war. As I mentioned earlier, Italy's invaded in September of '43, and in the ensuing months, the region of Foggia, just above the heel of the Italian boot, is captured. A lot of airfields that previously belonged to the Germans and the Italians were put to use, and they built a lot more new ones. And you can see that the distance here between Italy and Ploesti is very much reduced. At the same time, there was an argument in Allied higher commands about where to put the focus or the emphasis of the bombing effort. A lot of people said, hey, we need to focus on transportation targets, marshalling yards, bridges, railroad tracks. Well, you bomb those and they're pretty easily repaired. Other folks said, the Germans need oil. Let's kill the refineries. Refineries, you can't bury them, you can't hide them, you can damage them, and you can keep up the pressure by continuing to attack them. The Germans can't fight without oil. Well, in the end, they ended up hitting both transportation and oil targets and other types of targets. But they also put together a coherent campaign to hit Ploesti beginning in April of 1944, using large numbers of B-24s and now B-17s who could reach the target in traditional high-altitude attacks, like they were doing from England across all of Western Europe. These higher altitude attacks were less accurate, but they sustained fewer losses, and also because they were being escorted by American fighter aircraft, they helped bleed down the German Luftwaffe because they were killing a lot of German pilots as they tried to defend Ploesti. And it should be noted that the RAF, the Royal Air Force, also participated with a number of small nighttime raids. So from April to August of 1944, they put together a series of 23 raids against Ploesti, worked out to running on to 14,000 sorties on 23 different missions. They lost 254 aircraft, which that's considerable, but it was a 2% loss rate as compared to the low-level raid, which was almost 30%. And it worked because the infrastructure was no sooner repaired than it was bombed again, repaired, bombed again, repaired, until they were exhausted. They were out of labor, they didn't have the parts, they didn't have the material. The production coming out of Ploesti was a trickle. Now, I mentioned that the loss rate was much less, 2%. But if you were in the 2%, that didn't mean it was any less terrible. And I will read an excerpt that tells about the July 28th mission on which Phil McLaughlin and his co-pilot, Herbert Hawkins, flew their B-24. As they approached the target, they were hit by German fighters, which killed a number of their crew. Then as they got closer to the target, they were taken under fire by heavy anti-aircraft guns, and they were hit. Immediately, the entire inside of the B-24 was engulfed in a raging fuel-fed fire. Hawkins turned around in his seat to look back at a mass of flames that came almost into the cockpit. An instant later, another explosion ripped the flight deck. Hawkins was blown halfway through the canopy, upside down. His legs and much of his torso were flailing in the cascade of air that was tearing over the doomed bomber. Only his head and shoulders protruded into the cockpit. From this gruesome vantage point, he could see that McLaughlin and the top turret gunner, Donald Sherman, were on fire and likely already dead. He did struggle free, activated his parachute, which was damaged, and he hit hard and broke a leg and an ankle. He was reunited with the bombardier, Adam Wiley. They were herded up by the Romanians and put aboard trucks that were already loaded with crewmen from other downed bombers. Several of the men were seriously injured, but were given no medical attention. Many of the wounded men died during the trip, and they were all taken to the central square at Ploesti and then pushed out. They were immediately surrounded by a crowd of angry Romanians. There had been civilian casualties. One small and furiously anguished man singled out Hawkins and Wiley for whatever reason and demanded that they be executed because his wife and children had just been killed. At this point, an elderly woman stepped forward and, in an extreme act of kindness, tore strips from her clothing and began treating some of the injured airmen. Her actions seemed to have a calming effect, and no one was executed. So it's the end of August 1944. Ploesti has been turned into an ashtray at this point. The Russians are advancing on Bucharest and Ploesti. When they arrive, they are greatly distressed. They had planned on using Ploesti for themselves. We didn't care about their distress. But there was a problem. We had 1,100 plus prisoners of war in the vicinity, and we wanted to get them back. We didn't want the Russians to get hold of them. We didn't want the Germans to do anything to them. The Romanians were ambivalent because at this point, they switched sides. They were under pressure from the Russians. The Germans were obviously losing, so they made the decision to ally themselves with the Soviet Union. This caught the Germans by surprise. As you can imagine, they had fought together for 4 years. They had flown together, they trained together. In some instances, they lived together. So what happened next is really weird, but they took what was essentially a 2-day timeout, got separation from each other, and then started fighting again. And what was really weird is the Romanians operated German Me-109s, as did the Germans. So you had Me-109s fighting with other Me-109s. Very odd indeed. Meanwhile, the American POWs. The senior American POW got together with a Romanian higher-ranking fighter pilot, and the Romanian offered to fly him to Italy to coordinate a rescue of these POWs. Tough to do. So they took an Me-109, they covered it, they painted American flags all over it, took out the radios, and took this senior American POW, James Gunn, stuffed him in that radio compartment, and then the Romanian flew him to Italy. Now, can you imagine Colonel Gunn's mindset? Here he's stuffed into a dark enemy aircraft. He has no control. It's cold. He can't see anything. He's probably hypoxic at higher altitude, yet he had the guts to go ahead and do that. And what happened is they put together a plan such that they flew a number of B-17s right into the Bucharest-Ploesti area, loaded aboard the POWs, and got them all out within 2 days. It was a remarkable and unusual achievement. So then, just to summarize, as you can imagine, the Germans relied to a remarkable degree on Ploesti, 30 to 40% of their oil, depending on who was doing the calculating. Taking that out certainly deprived them of a significant source of oil, and they were essentially fuel-starved for the remainder of the war. It constrained Germany's ability to act and react on all fronts. And ultimately, the story of Ploesti leaves a legacy of heroics and sacrifice, and validated the United States Army Air Force's strategic bombing concept. And that's all I have for you. Do I have any questions at all?